You're listening to the Mind Your Own Business podcast, aimed at helping photographers learn how to make the leap from amateur to pro. Hello and welcome to the Mind Your Own Business podcast, a joint effort brought to you by Photofocus and Skip Cohen University. This is Shamira Young, and I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Skip Cohen. Skip, how are you?
I'm fine, and it's just another amazing day in Florida. Every single day lately has been the same. I ask Alexa every night before I go to bed what the weather's going to be, and it's going to be 77 with a high of 88, intermittent thunderstorms, and mostly sunny. I mean, it's kind of nice when you get that consistency, except one of our pups is scared to death of thunder, and she knows exactly. It's like 3 o'clock every day. We'll find her under the bed somewhere. So, moving right along and out of Florida weather, we have a great podcast today, and I am pumped.
Would you like to do the honors?
I would love to.
Introduce our guest. Yeah.
We are talking with one of the finest food photographers in the industry, Andrew Scrivani. Now, the fun of working with Andrew is that his work goes so much deeper than just capturing images that make our mouths water. He's an author, he's an educator, he's definitely an artist, and his YouTube channel is jam-packed with great content. His work has been shared in dozens of cookbooks and publications around the world covering just about every cuisine. And in fact, I noticed one this morning that tied in with sushi, which is one of my favorites. We're going to be talking about Andrew's journey into food photography, and along the way, the importance of relationship building with clients, special projects, education, and maybe even what it takes to do a book project. So, Andrew, this is the cue for your lips to move. Welcome to Mind Your Own Business.
Oh, thanks for having me, Skip. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, these are fun to do. And as I've said to you, and we've said to other people that join us, these are meant to be just fun and about as complicated as if we sat down next to each other as on a plane, obviously with an empty middle seat and being socially distant these days. And one of us said, so what do you do?
Exactly. Yeah. So, what do you do, Skip? Oh, you're
right now.
Me. That's right.
Talk
I'm sorry.
to you.
I'm not the interviewer this time. Okay, I got it.
Oh, I can tell this is going to be a party already.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, we are so thrilled to have you. And full disclosure, I'm looking through your portfolio through your website, and I've looked through it before, but this morning I have yet to have breakfast. I'm doing a short intermittent fast, and looking at your portfolio is driving me crazy because my mouth is literally watering. I mean, your work, your tear sheets, your experience, it's really impressive. And so I think we're going to kick it off with our favorite first question. Give us some info about your background and how you got started into food photography and how you ended up doing what you're doing today.
It's an interesting story in that it's not traditional in any way. I mean, from a food photographer's perspective, I guess that part of it is fairly traditional. I grew up around food in an Italian-American household. I learned how to cook at a young age. I spent a lot of time in my grandmother's kitchen. So the familiarity with food and how culturally relevant it is in my life and how ingrained it was in the social activities around my family is not unlike other people who got involved in food or photography or both. The art part of this, as far as becoming a photographer, is a little bit more of a winding road. I met my best friend, who is still my best friend, when we were 18 years old, the summer after high school. And he was trying to date my cousin, and she wanted me to vet him. So I got on the phone with the guy, and we started talking about the Ramones. It was literally the first conversation we ever had. And immediately we realized we were going to be really good friends. And he happened to be a photographer, and he was going to be starting in the fall at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. So fast forward a couple of years later, where I had been playing baseball at St. Peter's College in Jersey City, which was a Division I school. I was a baseball player. I got hurt. And I decided, okay, I'm going to go back home to New York, and I'm going to go to Baruch College in Manhattan, which happened to be across the street from the School of Visual Arts. And Joe was there. So I spent an awful lot of time in the studio with Joe as either a subject, or just working with him as an assistant, and I would follow him around, and I was sort of his free labor, holding the bounce card or humping gear or whatever. But I got kind of a free education in photography at one of the best art schools in New York City, and I would show up to classes there. There were professors who thought I was a student there, and it was an interesting sort of introduction into photography. And then, of course, life took over. I went to become a teacher, and Joe went off to become a photographer. And then, I guess, around 8 or 9 years later, I was looking for a career change. I was going through some life changes, and I started hanging out with Joe and all my photo friends again. And, I was a fairly skilled amateur photographer at that point. And I met, through networking with Joe and his friends, I met editors and producers and art directors and all these other photographers. And I ended up getting an assignment here and an assignment there. And I ended up with an assignment for the New York Times in the news section, but it happened to be in a supermarket where I had to go into the meat department and sneak a camera in and take pictures of people buying meat. Of course, this was really frowned upon in supermarkets. If they caught you, they would throw you right out. So I did this. I did a good job. They liked my work. So now I was on the roster. So now they knew that I was a photographer locally, and they could count on me to go do certain things. That led to different assignments in different places. And it turned out that because that first assignment was in a supermarket, the food section sort of took notice and said, oh, that guy, he's local, we can get him to go shoot some stuff. So I would go out and shoot a restaurant. And then I got a great opportunity to really sort of do something more food related at an ice cream shop that I grew up going to in Staten Island, which I wrote about in my book. This kind of one thing led to another. Sam Sifton, who is still the food editor at the New York Times, took notice of my work, and they reached out to me on something, I think it was like Christmas Eve, or it was the day after Christmas or something, back in 2002, and said, we have this recipe for congee, which is basically rice porridge, and we need a picture of it. Do you think you could make it and take a picture of it? I'm like, sure, why not? So I did it. I took a picture of this horrible looking rice porridge, made it look pretty. And from that point on, they just kept asking me to make food and take pictures of it. There was no culture of this at that point at the Times, or anywhere else for that matter, where a photographer was cooking his own food, shooting it in daylight, and making making the whole production on their own. So I kind of got involved with the right people at the right time with the right skill set. And that sort of launched my career, and it just grew from there. And it wasn't something I intended to do. I didn't intend to become a food photographer. It just happened to have the right set of skills that translated into a time and place in both photography and food that was, really advantageous for me.
When you talked about photographing in a market of people buying meat, if you had seen me on video, you'd see me laughing because I had a next door neighbor when I was with Rangefinder, WPPI in California, and my next door neighbor got in a fight one day with Dom DeLuise over a 2-day-old markdown roast at the market in the Palisades. And I just remember him coming back furious because he'd lost out to Dom DeLuise, who sadly has passed away a long time ago, but just funny. I can picture you sneaking in a camera and taking pictures of people buying meat, and you would have had a front row seat.
That would have been amazing.
Yeah, it would have been a great shot. But you hit on something just now as you were talking about networking, and it just, all those people and the editor at the New York Times. Let's talk a minute about relationship building, because I think a lot of times I'll write about and remind people, and Shamar too, that there's a conference coming up and you need to be out there and you need to build your relationships and you need to get to know people. Talk a little bit about how relationships have played a role in your career, because that old line about it takes a village, it really does. And you never know where those relationships are going to go to.
Well, that last point you made is exactly what was running through my mind when you were asking me the question. Was somebody said to me very early on in this career is, do not burn bridges at publications, because you never know where those people are going to end up. So the idea is that, if you meet people in this industry, they change jobs, they change roles, they move around from magazine to magazine, from ad agency to ad agency. And that thought in my head was just continue to maintain these relationships and work really hard at being somebody that makes it easy on the creatives that you have to work with, and that people who are going to potentially be in your life, professionally for a long time, treat those relationships with a lot of care. And that has come back to me on so many occasions where I met somebody, we worked together, we had a good opportunity, that person left that particular place, and then 5 years later, 10 years later, they come back and said, we had a great relationship, we worked really well together, would you like to do this project with me? And I'm currently at that phase in my career where a lot of the stuff that I did when I was younger and a lot of the relationships that I built when I was in the early parts of my career, a lot of those people are pretty successful in the industry right now, and they're looking for a pro that they know they could work with. And luckily, I knew enough at that point in my career to be mindful of maintaining and cultivating good relationships with people in the industry, because it is a very small place.
Yeah, I think for those of you listening who are relatively new, when you meet somebody for the first time or second or third time, never underestimate their links to other people in the industry. I know at one point I left Polaroid and went to Hasselblad, and I remember half the staff at Fuji at the time had come out of Polaroid. And this industry is very incestuous when it comes to all of us working for the same company, other companies, having new jobs. I love your line, don't burn any of those bridges with past relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of those particular situations where, you've had, and there have been times when I've had difficult relationships with different editors or different creative directors or art directors. And the instinct in me was, I just want to tell these people off, or I just want to tell them I never want to work with them again, or whatever. And of course, I didn't do that. And I just recently had an assignment with an editor that I haven't worked with in about 5 years, because we had a rough patch, but we kind of just went our separate ways. We kind of, cooler heads prevailed. And then, we got back together a few years later and did some really good work together. So it's just a matter of maturity, foresight, and the idea that you're a professional and this is your business, and you can't let your personal feelings kind of get in the way, as much as we as artists rely on that drive, that creative drive that is very personal. But from a business perspective, you need to let that go.
Well, you and I had a very short conversation, just to give our listeners an example. I worked with Arlene Evans at WPPI. In fact, I was part of the team that hired her at the time. And then she left there to go to Creative Live. And you met her at Creative Live. And today she's director of WPPI. So, it just runs through. There's so many people in this industry that have had so many different hats they've worn in their career.
It's true. It's very true. And, and I think that going back to what I said earlier, when you make people's life easier when they hire you to do a job, they don't forget that, because that's not always the norm. And that when you build that relationship, it's one that lasts, because once you've got a reputation as somebody who's easy to work with, it's just as powerful as that reputation as somebody who's difficult to work with. So you have to fall on that side of the fence in order to maintain those relationships, because a lot of those people are going to be around for a really long time.
Good point.
You said it. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Andrew, just to kind of shift gears a little bit, I'm curious about challenges that you've faced over the years as you've built up your business. Are you willing to share with us one of your biggest challenges? Does anything come to mind that you've had to face and how you overcame that?
I think the nature of a shifting industry in more recent time has been one of the bigger challenges I've had. I led a fairly charmed life at the beginning of my photography career, I have to admit. And I think that after building a reputation, becoming a leader in the industry, and then watching the industry shift so dramatically in the last 5 years, and watching some, tried and true clients and kind of methods of doing the work that we've done shift, I think that has been one of the bigger challenges for me as somebody who's been around for 20 years. And it's very easy to walk into a situation and basically feel entitled because, oh, well, I've been here since the beginning. But the reality is, if you don't shift and change with the times, if you're not adjustable, adaptable, and aware of what's happening in your industry, you're going to find yourself on the outside looking in through the glass. And I was sort of on the cusp of that and realizing that I had to make some adjustments in both the way I was doing business and the way I was cultivating relationships within that business, and have made fundamental shifts in how I operate. And I think that has been a very big challenge because as a small business owner or an independent contractor, you're only as good as the last job. And if you're not keeping up with the times, if you're not understanding the marketplace, and if you're not really, you run the risk of becoming a dinosaur really quickly. And I found myself feeling that way, and I needed to make some changes. And that's been an interesting sort of shift in my career where I felt like you go from being a leader to watching a lot of other people find success relatively quickly who are not as skilled, who are not as well known, or whatever whatever adjectives or you want to put on that. You can't begrudge those people their success. You just have to kind of find a new way to do your work.
That's very interesting. Are there any specific shifts that come to mind or that you can talk about?
Yeah, I think that the idea that editorial food photography is shifting to people who have significant social media followings. And rather than looking at the quality of the photography or the experience that goes behind making the photography, it really becomes about whether or not you have a built-in audience attached to it. And I think that because editorial and advertising as well have started to rely heavily on social media, that those people who have social media presence have more value in the market. So it's really about whether or not you can move the needle rather than whether you can move people emotionally with your work. And I think that shift for me has been profound, to understand it and navigate it and be mindful of it and not resentful of it.
Hey, so let's change gears just for a second, because I love your book. In fact, I'm nuts about your work. I think when Sheila and I are trying to figure out where we're going to go out to dinner on those nights when we bail out of the cooking ourselves, I think all I need to do is go to your website and decide what cuisine we want, and then pray that the food is as good wherever we're going as what you photographed. Let's talk about the discipline it takes to write a book.
Sure.
There's so many people listening now that are thinking, someday I want to do a book. They haven't thought through, is it going to be educational? Is it going to be a coffee table top book? Talk about the discipline. I've been involved in a few of them, and I don't think people realize what it takes beyond just the initial idea.
Yeah, I think when it came to writing my book, one of the things that was really important to me, and something that I've been approached a number of times by different publishers who wanted me to write a book. And every time it came down to the idea of how to frame the work, it all felt very pedantic to me, and it felt very textbooky. And I wasn't interested in doing that. So I kept kicking it down the road. And then finally, after doing a number of books with Kate McDermott for Countryman Press, the editor, who I've become friendly with, asked me, when are you going to write a book? And I said, when somebody lets me write the book I want to write. And she laughed. And she's like, well, what is that? I said, well, I want it to be conversational. I want it to be anecdotal. I don't want it to be a textbook. I don't want to draw diagrams. I don't want it to be solely about the technical aspects of setting up your camera. And she's like, well, I've seen you teach on Creative Live. She's like, why don't you just do that? And I said, wow, that's amazing. That's exactly what I want to do. I just want to write a book the way I teach. So I went about sort of trying to wrap my head around that. And that's where the discipline comes in, because the first thing I had to do was create an outline that was comprehensive, in that it made sense, where I could tell the story of my career in food photography while overlaying the idea of teaching people the process I went through and having anecdotal stories to attach to those. So I went through all of my Creative Live classes and looked at all the curricula that I built to teach those classes. And I went through them line by line, and I created the outline for the book. And then with that, every time I got to a section, I wrote down some notes as to what anecdotal story I wanted to tell that was attached to that lesson. So, because obviously when I'm doing that on camera, a lot of times I'm working off the hip. Like I give myself a cue or a prompt, and then I just tell a story. So I needed to rebuild that mechanism, but do it on paper or on a computer. And then once I had the outline, the discipline to force myself to sit down and write. And I was finding it very difficult to write in my studio or write in my home where there were no other people around. And I never really experienced this before, because I'd never written a book before, but I felt like I needed the energy of other people around me to write. So I used to go to cafes. So I went to Blue Bottle Cafe on Clinton Street, which unfortunately closed during the pandemic, and I wrote half my book in that place. And I went to this little cafe on the corner of Canal and Division Street called Little Canal, and I would sit there and I would write my book. Or I would go, so I would just take, or I'd go to Stumptown, or one of all these different little cafes around the Lower East Side. I would take my laptop or my iPad, and I would go and sit down, and I would say, I'm going to write a chapter today. And I wouldn't leave the cafe until I wrote a chapter. And I would do this over and over and over again. And it took me, about 8 months to finish the book. But the reality was setting a schedule, having an outline, knowing what I wanted to write before I sat down in front of the computer, finding a suitable place to inspire me and get me energized to write. All of those things had to happen for the book to happen.
I just figured out why I have several books that I want to do. I've got, 45 pages or so of a manuscript of one done. And I just realized why I can't seem to get it done, because the other ones, I haven't been in a Starbucks in forever, but I used to love, and I'm not a coffee drinker, but getting a biscotti and sitting there in a Starbucks, it never occurred to me that, wow, that was such a great place to write. And I've been trying to do it in my home office, and I'm interrupted by phone calls, by puppies. Even when I shut everything out, it doesn't make a difference. I need to get back into a Starbucks.
Yeah, the energy that's supplied by the people in a busy place, there's something about it. It really is. I find it really inspiring.
Well, one thing you hit on there was the word discipline. It really does. It really does take a huge amount of discipline. And there's so many people out there who I would love to see do a book, but first you got to decide what it's going to be. And then once you're done with that part, as it morphs into something else and something else and something else again, it's staying focused. And it's funny because photographers that want to do books, every one of them knows how to hold focus on their camera, but not when it comes to a special project.
Yeah, it's unique, and I think it does require a lot of focus and attention and that word discipline. It's everything about creating art seems to run counter to the idea of being disciplined about it, because most people think art is something that just sort of flows out of you naturally. But if you ask anybody who creates art regularly or professionally or, prolifically, they all have a system, they all have extreme discipline, and that is where the idea of the right and the left brain sort of comes together in those moments.
Sure does.
Love it. And so, Andrew, after you finished your book, how did you spread the word about it?
Well, I mean, it was interesting because the book dropped in November of 19, and I was about to go do some work out at Creative Live again in Seattle. We were in the process of promoting a film that I produced that was out in the festival circuit. So I was out and about doing a lot of interviews. I was doing a lot of, sort of in-person appearances. I did some book signings, and I did some podcasts. I did some radio interviews. So I was getting a lot of attention at that point because both the book and the movie were about to drop at the same time. And we were sort of running full stride in, through the holiday season of 2019. And as we kind of turned the clock into 2020, and then all of a sudden the pandemic hit and everything stopped. So I literally only got about 4 months to promote the book in earnest. I did maybe 2 book signings, and then everything stopped. So it was a unfortunate situation on so many levels for so many people. The least of it is the fact that I couldn't promote my book properly, but it definitely was an unfortunate timing for a book launch.
Well, moving on from books and into special projects, we're just about out of time, and I know Shamara's got one of her favorite last questions to ask. But before we do that, you're involved in a very cool podcast. I know you're doing a lot in online education. Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's also part of what I love about your diversity as an educator and an artist.
Yeah, I mean, recently I've been doing some passion projects. One is I've been waiting and wanting to do some work with a good friend of mine, a guy that most people know as Chef John. He's got an enormous following on YouTube with foodwishes.com. And he and I have started the Chef John podcast. We're about 8 or 9 episodes in at this point. You can find it on all major podcasting platforms, and we've had so much fun doing it, and we really are enjoying that part of the project. And then the other thing that I've been doing is a lot of online education. As a lot of people know, I've done a lot of recorded work with platforms like Creative Live. But what I'm doing now with a company called Speakeasy is actually live classes on Zoom. And I just got done with a 15-week fellowship with 17 photographers who I worked with for like between 2 and 3 hours a week as their teacher, their coach, their professional mentor. And we had some amazing success with that program that we're going to do another one very shortly. My page on speakeasy.com gives listings of all of the different educational sort of things I'm involved in there, including one-to-one executive coaching for creatives and some of my new classes. So I'm super passionate about teaching. I was a teacher before I was a photographer, and it sort of found me again. So that's I don't necessarily know if I would call these special projects, but they're definitely sort of extensions of what I do every day.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure to include those links in the show notes so that people can check that out. And, Andrew, I do want to wrap it up with our favorite final question. And it's so funny every time I ask it because we get a different answer. And it's such a loaded question. What advice do you have for photographers who are starting out today? What would you tell them to do first?
Don't compare yourself to other photographers.
Love it.
That is the thing that I find over and over again when I'm working with photographers who come to me educationally is they find themselves comparing themselves to other photographers and then suffering from what a lot of people call imposter syndrome, which I've outlawed in my classes. We're not allowed to talk about imposter syndrome, because ultimately, if you are in an educational setting, trying to better yourself, you're certainly not an imposter. So I think it's, you have to give yourself time to develop a style. You have to know what language you want to speak with your camera. And I think it's important to give yourself that time and space to discover how to speak that language, because ultimately it doesn't happen overnight. I know that the whole world moves very fast, but you can't rush these things. And if you feel like you're struggling, you're probably not struggling. You're probably just going through the normal growing pains of becoming an artist.
Perfect answer.
Yes. Oh, it's so true. And it's so funny how imposter syndrome seems to strike new photographers, new creatives, and even seasoned ones who've been in it for years and years. So, Andrew, I love that you highlight that we should not be comparing our work to others, because we're all unique and different.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would do an exercise in my classes all the time where I would set up a shot and give everybody the camera with the same settings and ask everyone to take a picture, and everybody's picture looked different. So it proved the point.
Oh, that's so great. That is so great. Where can folks check your work out online, Andrew?
You can find my work at my website, which is just my name, andrewscrivani.com. And if you can spell my name, you can find me on all social media, because I go just by my first and last name as one word. Andrew Scrivani on Instagram, mostly on Instagram. I don't really do so much on other platforms right now. It seems to be the platform that I have the biggest following and the most sort of comprehensive way to show you my work. Facebook, and I'm there, but I'm not. It's not the place to follow me. So come and see me on Instagram. That's probably your best bet.
Excellent. And we'll make sure to include a direct link to your website in the show notes so that people can easily find you. And Skip, as always, where can folks hunt you down online?
And as always, it's the same answer. I'm Skip Cohen on Twitter. I'm Skip Cohen on Facebook. Everything I write every day is at skipcohenuniversity.com. And we always want to get feedback, and I'm always asking for it. And sometimes we get feedback, and a lot of times you guys are very quiet out there. But my email is skip@mei500.com, and asking you the same question all the time, Shamira. Where do they go to find you?
Yes, folks can send me an email at shamira@photofocus.com. That's my first name, CHAMIRA, @photofocus.com. We love getting questions, ideas, feedback, even recommendations from people, from our listeners, as far as future guests that they'd like us to chat with on our show. Skip and I get such a kick out of doing this show and just speaking with such amazing talent. And speaking of amazing talent, Andrew, thank you. This was awesome.
You shared a lot of great insight today. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm really happy we got to meet, and I'm really honored that you asked me to be on your show.
Well, it's
Absolutely.
been a kick.
Yes, it has. And we also want to thank our listeners for joining us on this episode of the Mind Your Own Business podcast. Please spread the word to your photography friends, especially if they want to bring their businesses up to the next level. This episode has been brought to you by Photofocus and Skip Cohen University.